This place, called the Gold Coast, is growing extremely fast. We hear that mentioned time and time again, over and over. How big, how fast, how large can it get? How many more people can this city of ours possibly take? Pressures of city living, public transport issues, styles of housing, should it be high density or low density? The environmental factors attached to existing in between the beauty of the beach and the beauty of a very, very green hinterland. Smart cities, innovation, shifting demographics and how that affects things. There is a lot that goes into the urban planning puzzle, and that's why we've started up our own urban planning kind of think tank on a Thursday afternoon. It's called the Urban Squeeze. It even has its own music. So all those things I mentioned and a whole heap more will be the topics of discussion this time each week. I'm joined by Associate Professor Jason Byrne, Dr Tony Matthews, and as well. They're both from Griffith University. Urban planning is their thing, and they are chomping at the bit, let me tell you, to share with you the knowledge that they've accumulated over the journey. Tony and Jason, great to have you along. Thanks for you. Wanted to talk today about housing specifically. What are some of the challenges that are going to be confronted in the future here on the Gold Coast, specific to the Gold Coast in this space?
Some of those challenges exist at the moment. So, for example, one of the things that's on the minds of my students is, are they going to be able to afford to buy a house? You know, for a long time, for many Australians, it was the great Australian dream of home ownership. That may be changing.
Home ownership might take a very different form in the future. It may not be the detached house on the suburban block. That may not be available in the future to a huge portion of the market. We don't really know, but it's looking like that right now.
Yeah, okay. The Gold Coast specifically, it's kind of, I mean, if you look at it geographically, it's a narrow strip between the ocean. We can't go out that way. It's just not going to work, although some people have proposed plans in that regard, but we'll leave that alone for now. Hinterland, we've got, you know, pretty rugged countryside and plenty of green space that, in all likelihood will be preserved as such. The only way is up, isn't it?
Yeah, it pretty much is. I mean, a lot of that green space is World Heritage Rainforest, so that can't be built on. Thank goodness it's protected.
I think up is certainly one of the more live options for the Gold Coast. And the other thing about the Gold Coast is between the sea and the hinterland, there's an awful lot of water because of all the canal estates and the river systems. So there's actually not as much developable land as people might think there is. Take a look at the Gold Coast from the sky. Have a look at an aerial shot or a Google map, and it's a lot of water.
Tony Matthews, Dr Tony Matthews, I should give you a proper honorific, lecturer in urban and environmental planning at the School of Environment, Griffith University. Jason Byrne is an associate professor in the same place, the School of Environment at Griffith University. Urban Squeeze, the name of this segment. Okay, so if we're talking about affordability and housing and the people, the kids that you teach, your students, all of the age where in a couple of years they'll start thinking about these sorts of things, and the trend will be upwards, high-rise type development. Doesn't that sort of offer a nice, neat little transfer here? In, you know, the quarter-acre block can be a thing of the past. People can buy their flat. Everyone wins, don't they?
Maybe. I mean, Australians are not very good at used to living in the sky. There's a lot of issues where people like to party still, that kind of stuff. How would their neighbours feel if they're right on top of each other? And children in the sky as well. How does that work when you've got a couple of kids and maybe a dog? How's that going to work in a high-rise situation?
Yeah,
what do you think, Tony?
This is a big thing. Australians don't buy into this idea of living in apartments in tall towers when they start families. That's when they want the one house on the block of land, so they have a garden, they can play cricket there, they can let the kids run around.
Have the yard they enjoyed when they were a kid.
That's it. There's chooks.
Yeah, there's a big psychological resistance to the idea of apartment living as a long-term option, particularly for people that are looking to start families.
Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of problems here. What about solutions? What do some some other cities in the world do to overcome this issue?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at the Chinese cities. The Chinese are used to raising families in apartments. They don't even own their apartments. You know, they have a 99-year lease on their dwellings. So those solutions exist. Scandinavian countries, it's common not to own your own place. You rent there, long-term rentals.
Yeah, you see a lot of that in Europe, and there's very strong rental protections in place for people. They have long-term leases, maybe 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, and the agreement is that what they have to do is return the unit in the condition that they got it in, and during the term of the lease they're basically left alone.
Okay.
Whereas the way the rental system works here, it's short-term leases, it's insecure, there can be difficulties with multiple inspections and entries from landlords and agents, and you don't get that level of privacy and ownership over your space. That's one major problem for
Hard
sure.
to have a pet. If you have a pet, a lot of people like to have their dog or their cat with them. It's very, very difficult for people like that to find an apartment.
91.7 ABC Gold Coast. This is the Urban Squeeze. On debut this afternoon. My guests, both from Griffith University, Associate Professor Jason Byrne and Dr. Tony Matthews as well. Urban planning is their thing. From an urban planning perspective, then, and an affordability type, can we sort of project? What do you envisage when you look in your crystal ball for the Gold Coast? I mean, these are the things that you guys ponder and pontificate. What do you see?
I think we're missing part of the puzzle. Like at the beginning you mentioned this idea of a puzzle. It really is a puzzle. The missing bit that I can see is medium density. It doesn't necessarily have to be the kind of skyscrapers we see in Surfers Paradise.
What do you mean by medium density?
Medium density, right, good. Sometimes we get lost in the jargon. We're talking like, if you imagine West End, the workers' cottages on 200 square metre lots, fairly small, tight houses that are next to each other, the terraces that you might see in Sydney and Melbourne. This is the sort of density that I'm talking about, where you still might have a little bit of yard space, but you're able to get people into a smaller area. Tony?
Yeah, this is not a foreign design concept in this country. It's just one that we have tended to increasingly move away from. And particularly in the last decade, there's been a trend towards larger houses, so taking up the entire block, or as much of it as is practicable, so that you just have a path running around the side and the back of the house.
That's fascinating to me because of the amount of time on social media that's given to sharing, the so-called tiny house or tiny dwelling movement, these fantastic design concepts that have a family of 4 or 5 living essentially in a shoebox perfectly comfortably.
Yeah.
Why this conflict and contrast, do you think?
I think the thing about the tiny house movement is that tiny house movement is very good at promoting itself, and it is going to work really well for some people, but it's not going to work so well for other people because they are extremely constrained units. I mean, they are tiny. The bed, the kitchen, the living area, everything is effectively in one room.
Yes.
So it's almost like a return to the student bedsit days with a slightly more contemporary PR vibe around it.
You'd want to be a fairly heavy sleeper. My concern, and it'd be shared by plenty here on the Gold Coast, is where are you going to put your surfboard?
Yeah, absolutely.
Immediately.
Especially if you have to fold up the bed.
Yes, this is true. Maybe a bed-surfboard combination. I don't know. Okay, so medium density housing, is that kind of development actively encouraged here on the Gold Coast? Is it something that all the talk seems to be high-rise all the time? What about this medium density option?
Well, we've got a brand new town planning scheme on the Gold Coast, and for the first time it's starting to explore these smaller lots down to 200 square metres in areas where the council thinks it's appropriate. I think there's probably a lot of the Gold Coast we could do that on, especially in some of the older suburbs where the houses are reaching the end of their kind of normal lifespan. There may be opportunities to put 3, even 4 houses on some of those blocks, but in a different configuration than what Australians have normally been used to.
Okay.
So not the tiny house, not the Mac Mansion that takes up the entire block, somewhere a bit in between.
Not a lot of space here on the Gold Coast, though. There's not a lot of fresh greenfield sites to be able to do this, so I'm suspecting that there might be some people listening this afternoon rubbing their fingers together going, ooh, time to subdivide. What about the subdivision situation here on the Gold Coast? Is that being explored as an opportunity, if you like?
I think by a lot of people they're looking at that opportunity. People who own existing houses on resaleable lots that could be subdivided, or either selling up the entire house and site, or they're seeking to subdivide themselves. This is what we in planning call urban consolidation. So it's basically introducing more density into existing space.
Okay.
And as you pointed out, Matt, there isn't a lot of unused space here. There's not a lot of new space on the Gold Coast. And the problem with urban consolidation is it tends to encounter a huge volume of community resistance. People don't like it.
Yes, which is my next question. There's a hurdle there. You talked about landholders perhaps being excited about this. Lawmakers, different kettle of fish. How do you overcome this situation? Jason?
Well, one of the interesting things we're seeing in Sydney particularly, Matt, but increasingly in Melbourne as well, is people getting together with their neighbours and building these kind of super lots. So they all get together and say, instead of me selling my house one at a time or trying to subdivide one at a time, let's 10, 15, 20 of us get together and then we'll sell this as one larger kind of lot that can be reworked. In that case, you kind of get away from some of the pressures that might come from people saying, I don't want this apartment building in my backyard overshadowing, looking into my bathroom, cutting off the sunlight. This type of issue that we've seen around for a while. What do you think, Tony?
I think that's good if you're in on the deal. If you're not in on the deal, I think it's problematic because what you're going to encounter in a situation like that where consolidated development comes to your neighbourhood is you're going to have a lot more traffic, you're going to have a lot more pressure on services, you're going to have a lot more activity at night time. There's just going to be a lot more life in your neighbourhood. You may lose sunlight, you may lose amenity, you may lose peace and quiet, and that's really what bothers people.
There's really a case of you can't have everything, though. There's someone, or can you? Look, Jason's eyes light up. Perhaps you can.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, so I've travelled fairly widely now. In Copenhagen, places like this, you can see what we would think of as this medium density development where the streets are still quiet, but that's because you have really good public transport. The kind of stuff we're seeing with the light rail here, right? So not everybody needs to have a car. They're using bicycles to get around, do their shopping, which is just around the corner, living above shops, this sort of stuff.
Well, I think Jason's raised a good point. Having to accommodate cars is a huge problem. So if you build a unit development, maybe a 6-pack or something like that, 6 apartments in the one unit, you have to accommodate maybe 10 cars. And that requires a huge volume of space as well. So those cars have to either go out front, which requires land use, or they have to go underneath, which ups the building cost. So that's a big thing as well, and particularly somewhere like the Gold Coast, where just by virtue of the way that the place is put together, it is very car dependent. And there are positive efforts like the light rail to deal with that, but it's still a very car dependent place. And people need their cars to get around, and so their cars have to have somewhere to park overnight, and that's a huge driver of land use.
That's the catch, isn't it?
These are discussions that you obviously have at a philosophical level in among the halls of academia. At a pragmatic level, are these conversations taking place, you know, at Gold Coast City Council, for instance, or at higher levels of government as well? Is this always part of the common agenda by decision makers?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, we can look at some examples as well. So not just conversations, but people have actually been starting to explore some of these alternative forms. So if you've got a Varsity Lakes, we can see a kind of laneway development occurring there where you don't have to have the car and garage fronting onto the street. There may be a rear entry. You can have some kind of collective spaces that are opening up. Not everybody wants or needs a car. Sometimes maybe other people can use that space as well. So there's some flexibility and some options. And this is indeed what's on the minds of councillors and planners working in the state and local government.
I think Jason's absolutely right about that. One of the difficulties that happens down the line from that, though, is that the majority of housing that's built is built by private developers with private money, which is then sold back to the market. So you can put provisions in place for adequate forms of housing or styles or configurations of housing, but you're going to run up against developers who don't like the idea or are used to doing certain things a certain way and they don't want to change the way they do things, or the bank is unsure about lending for a different type of scheme. Right. And these are all flow-on problems that happen after the provisions are set down by council.
It's fascinating. So I feel like, this is the idea. We're just scratching the surface today, and there's much, much further to go with all of this, and we will in the days and weeks to come. We've run out of time for now, though, but I want to pick up, perhaps we can touch on again that affordability thing, if what that will actually do to a housing market, and perhaps how that, what the experience is internationally in places where the style of housing has changed as populations have grown. Maybe that's a good spot to pick up next time.
Yeah.
I'd love to have you back.
It's been great, Matt.
Love to be back.
Excellent. Sorry about your mic earlier. Associate Professor Jason Byrne and Dr. Tony Matthews, both from Griffith University, the School of Environment specifically. Urban Squeeze is the segment.